Hello there, John Cuturillo here, the counsellor of your listener. Thank you for joining me for this episode. As usual, thank you to everyone who makes it possible for me to live my vision every day, be you a client who allows me the privilege of entering into your life to help you with your goals, or as a listener or supporter of the podcast. Thank you to everyone. Today I'm going to be discussing whether it's acceptable to ever use force in communication, and by force I mean an approach that actually challenges the other person's comfort in the situation. One could equate it to verbal aggression. However, force is a quality that isn't necessarily intended to violate the person's sense of safety, but is intended to challenge their comfort in order to communicate a point. Now, as per usual, especially in topics like this, please do not ever take what you find on the internet as advice. If you have concerns of any kind, please seek advice from a professional. First, let's discuss the approaches to communication that we would advocate in therapy. And this is also relevant to the issue of why psychotherapists and similar helping professionals use empathy in their communication, something that I've discussed in previous episodes. When two or more people are in a conflict, it's much more common for people to assume that they are correct and the other person is incorrect than it is for that to actually be true. More often than not, either one person is overreacting or both people have experienced a misunderstanding of the situation and are actually both contributing to the conflict. Now, something I've discussed extensively in my past work is that the human mind does play tricks on us. Often it processes information in a way that does not reflect objective reality, or it leads us to believe ideas that are not necessarily the most adaptive, that aren't necessarily going to be the most helpful to us. And we are usually completely unaware that the mind is processing information in that manner, which means that when we're in the midst of conflict, often what is happening is our emotions are precluding us from objectively understanding what is actually happening in that situation. And something that's interesting is that when we are physiologically aroused in the way that we would be if we are in an agitated or an emotionally negative state, it actually affects our ability to perceive the positive aspects of a situation so that we are more likely to see the negatives and more likely to act only on those negatives. So there is a neurological effect to thinking negatively, so to speak. It's not just in your head, so to speak. It actually does have a real effect that limits how you think and manipulates how you think. So when you're in the midst of a conflict, there is a high risk that by receiving negativity from the other person and yourself exuding negativity, you are inadvertently not able to perceive all aspects of a situation and may not be aware of how you are contributing to it. This is not to victim blame. There are instances where this is not the case, and I'm going to discuss that shortly, but this is often an issue. The reason why we advocate for assertive but calm, rational, and non-violent communication in therapy, whether we're discussing scenarios in which we're communicating with our work colleagues, our boss, our friends, our partner, and this is especially relevant in relationship counselling, a good counsellor will teach people to imbue their communications with a non-threatening and non-forceful quality. And this is certainly how I work with my clients when I'm training them in communication skills. We posit that regardless of how emotionally heightened the situation is, we should aim to communicate to the other person what the issue is for us without being accusatory and without making the other person feel uncomfortable. Why do we do that? Because even if, theoretically speaking, we are completely correct and the other person is the one in the wrong, so to speak, the consequences of being forceful in our communication can often be that the conflict escalates. And again, even if we are technically correct, the consequences that result from the situation escalating may actually be worse than is worthwhile to obtain the satisfaction of demonstrating that we are the ones in the right. If we escalate conflict regularly, it may damage our relationship with someone that actually could have worse consequences for us in the long term. It may have worse consequences for other people as well. When we teach a non-threatening communication, we teach a range of different techniques. One of the most important ones is empathic listening. Now, empathic listening, as I've discussed in the past, means that when somebody tells us something, regardless of how they tell it to us, regardless of whether it's aggressive or assertive or passive, we demonstrate that we're listening to that person by providing what is called a reflection. It means we repeat to that person essentially what they've said in our own words, and perhaps even adding something to it, but in a way that demonstrates that we were listening properly and that we understand why that person is feeling the way they're feeling. When we respond with a view to trying to find a resolution for both parties. And if we have to express how we feel or what the effect on us is, we express it in a way that refers specifically to what our needs are and what we would like to happen in the situation, not what we dislike about the situation or what we don't like about the other person, and we don't become accusatory at all. When somebody receives this type of communication from us, their brain actually responds differently than if we were being aggressive or forceful in any way. It actually helps to activate the parts of the brain responsible not only for regulating their own anxiety, but also the parts of the brain necessary to engage in complex problem solving, which means that not only are they less likely to be aggressive, they're also more likely to have active the resources required to perceive and analyze the situation in a way that's actually more likely to result in a satisfactory solution for both of them. You can imagine how this is relevant to relationship counseling, and this is also why in therapy, regardless of how objectionable another person's behavior is, for example, if they're violent or have engaged in crimes or extreme misconduct, this is why therapists don't engage in anything that could be construed as blaming. Yes, we need to hold people accountable when they've clearly done something wrong, but we don't judge and we don't engage in blaming. And the reason for that is not because we approve necessarily of that person's behavior. It doesn't mean that we're condoning it or saying that it's not bad that what they did hurt somebody else. By being empathic, what we're actually doing is creating the psychological conditions in that person's mind in which they can stay calm, be honest, and then actually perceive the situation objectively so that they can see what they did wrong and what they need to do to change. Yes, there are certain things people need to hear, and even they may deserve to hear them. If someone's done something genuinely horrific, they deserve to hear that it was horrific. But the way that we communicate the essential information has to be in such a way that we are creating the conditions for them to change. And as I said, the brain actually responds differently when we communicate in that empathic manner. So for us, the vision is a long-term one. If we are patient and empathic with this person in the short term, they are more likely to see what they did wrong and why they should change, and then change so that they are less likely to hurt people in the future. That is the end goal, because in the end, you cannot change someone. Only a person can change themselves psychologically. So if we create the conditions for someone else to see why they should change, then that prevents harm in the future, and ultimately that's what we want. If we simply told people in a rather blunt fashion what they needed to hear, the likelihood is they've already heard it before. And the reason they haven't changed is that how they heard it and the context surrounding that communication didn't place their mind in the state at which they would be more likely to change, which again doesn't negate their responsibility. They are absolutely responsible for their behavior, but what we want is long-term positive change. So non-violent and calm empathic communication, more often than not, leave both parties in a state that is more satisfactory than what each would find if they were to simply tell the other person what they thought they needed to hear and prove themselves right, so to speak. Again, even if one person is technically at fault, if you prove yourself correct and prove the other person wrong and the other person doesn't respond well and the conflict continues, then think about what you're losing from that. Whatever's troubling you in that situation that was supposedly caused by the other person isn't going to stop necessarily, and it could get worse. So that's why we advocate for non-violent communication, for calm communication. Now, we have to consider an alternative situation. Part of life involves having to decide when to take risks. If you don't take risks at all in life, you are most likely going to lead an unsatisfactory existence. And part of therapy is helping people to decide what risks they're willing to take in life and then for them to own the consequences, because in the end, we cannot live a life free from risk. As I've discussed briefly in the past, there is a risk of being too passive. If we try too hard to not be forceful, we could also be too passive. There are instances in which people might incorrectly believe that we have made a mistake or that we're to blame for something. And if we don't emphatically correct them in a polite way, but in an emphatic way nonetheless, we could actually be teaching ourselves in the long term to be passive. And then it becomes a psychological precedent for how we respond to other people's communications. If we do that for too long, we may inadvertently create conditions in which people think they're always right about us and may actually think, gee, that person's always making mistakes, when in reality it's them who only thinks we're making mistakes and it's just that we haven't corrected them often enough. I've discussed this in a previous episode and explained how we can politely say, no, actually, I did do this correctly and here's the evidence. That's just when people have misunderstandings. Some people, when they notice that you're passive, can actually exploit you. And there are plenty of situations in the world in which people are genuinely at fault for events. Let's be honest, most of us are good people, most of us have the best of intentions, but there are instances in which people do wrong things where they should have known better, and often they did know better and they simply chose to do the wrong thing because it benefited them or it was convenient for them without any consideration for somebody else's interests. And there are instances in which we are to blame for things in the world. All of us can potentially cite those instances in which we've been to blame for something. Should we be violent? Of course not. But there is a possibility that by trying to be the peacekeeper all the time, we may actually allow people to exploit us. And sometimes it is perfectly possible that there are situations in which you have done a lot of wrong and it takes someone to sit you down and forcefully say, look, you should change. Sometimes that's what it genuinely takes for people to become aware of the situation and realise why they should change. Not always. Often, if people have the wrong intentions, other people admonishing them is not going to change them, but sometimes that is genuinely what people need to hear. Would I ever advise one of my clients to do that? Of course not, because the risk of escalating conflict is too high. It's the least likely solution. But talking from a purely human perspective, the world is a nasty place, and sometimes the only way to protect one's own rights is to use some force in communication by showing that person, I'm going to have to make you uncomfortable by the way I say this to show you why you shouldn't do certain things or how you're affecting me or why you need to stop doing something. We can't necessarily say that whenever someone chooses to use force in communication that they're inherently wrong, but it is an extremely ambiguous and complicated area. As I said, would I teach a client to do this? No, I would never teach a client to escalate a conflict because that puts them at risk and it puts the situation at risk as well. And in a conflict, would I immediately want to take the forceful position? No. I would try to de-escalate the conflict first. But intellectually or psychologically, there are situations in which I may evaluate the only way for this person to understand something that they truly need to is for me to be slightly forceful, and not for me to use expletives or to start insulting them, but for me to say, look, I'm unhappy about something in which you're involved, and I'd like you to know that I would like a resolution of this. Of course, I do question myself very thoroughly beforehand and know in advance that I'm not being unreasonable, and I'm open to being corrected if I am incorrect about something, but there are instances in which I myself might have to tell someone, look, we need to set some boundaries here. I'm not happy about something that you did. So while I wouldn't advise other people to do this, because I don't want to inadvertently lead them to a place where they're actually less likely to get a satisfactory outcome and more likely to continue the conflict, sometimes the world is not nice, and sometimes the only way to approach something is with a little bit of intellectual force. I can't tell you what situations those are, and again, I would never advise you to, but part of the occupational hazard of life is choosing when to be the peacekeeper and when to use some force. And life is so complex that there are no rules for that. You have to decide for yourself, what risks am I willing to take and what consequences am I willing to tolerate. We need to have a balance in our lives. On one hand, we need to be willing to admit when we're wrong, admit our mistakes, but when it is in our best interest or in someone else's best interest to stand on principle, sometimes standing on principle is the only way that you're going to achieve a fair outcome. And again, that's a decision that you have to make for yourself and you have to be willing to deal with the consequences. But it's a reflection that I believe we all have to make at some stage. So thank you for joining me for this episode. As usual, never take what you find on the internet as advice. Please seek advice from a professional if you have concerns in your life. And I would love to hear from my audience. If you have ideas about what you'd like to hear discussed on the program or you would like to be a collaborator or a guest, please contact me. I would love to hear from you. And until next time, take care.